Welcome to the SC Launch and Learn with Tyler Tatum of Three-Phase SC. Today, we are providing an introduction to SBIR and STTR grants. Before we begin, I'd like to go over two housekeeping items. First of all, if you can hear me, please raise your hand in the webinar's control. Thank you, Ricky, Carla, Jason. Great, thank you so much. Thank you. Secondly, on the format of today's webinar, we will keep all audience audio muted. So if you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the webinar controls at any time. We will pause about 20 minutes in for Q&A, and then again, we will have a Q&A session at the end. I will be reading the questions out loud, and Tyler will be answering them. My name is Julia Linton, and I serve as the Operations Manager for the SC Launch Program. With me is Mr. Tyler Tatum of Three-Phase SC. Tyler has helped companies procure over $6 million in SBIR and STTR funding in the last few years alone. He has over 20 years of experience in technology-focused startup ventures. Tyler's core strength is in his ability to turn customer needs into marketable products by facilitating communication between business leaders, current and prospective customers, and technology developers. Tyler, I'd like to welcome you here, and the mic is now yours.
Thanks everyone for joining, and also thanks to STRA for having us. It's always a pleasure to talk about SBIR, STTR, and work with other groups like you. There's a lot of content here, so I'm going to go pretty quickly, and definitely ask questions along the way, put questions in, and we'll do our best to take as many of those as possible. So thanks everyone for joining. So Three-Phase is a very unique resource. Just to give a little detail on Three-Phase itself, you're really, in South Carolina, we're really lucky to have this program where we get to go and do both, educational content like this webinar. We do seminars and workshops and a lot of outreach, but we also, for groups that get accepted into the program, we get to do one-on-one support with the companies and handhold them through the SBIR process, including everything from building your story to, some agencies like National Institute of Health, it's just getting it submitted because the application process can be overwhelming and complex. So the Three-Phase website is, the number 3phasesc.com. Definitely check it out, and, if you feel it's appropriate, you can apply. I'm going to jump in. So I like to break up the content a little bit, and I'm going to start out by talking about the SBIR STTR program in general. In terms of describing SBIRs, STTRs, and I'll get into the difference between those two, but I like to start out by talking about the life cycle of a company and how SBIR funding fits into that life cycle. SBIR really fills a hole between where you have an idea, especially with university-based startups, where you've gotten some funding and you've begun to develop a concept. You may not quite understand your customers that well, but you have enough proof that the technology works, but you may not have proof that you can build a product out of that technology. SBIRs are good to fill that gap. And one of the most important things to think about is, in terms of the life cycle of your business, you need to start thinking way ahead to where is my next pot of money, assuming I get phase 1 and phase 2 funding, and how can I set up my work product during the phase 1 and the phase 2 so that the people who want to give me money, like angel investors, VCs, or customers, that I've proved out what they need to understand about my product or my service offering during the SBIR process, so that I can get a check on the other end of that. And that's really the best way to utilize the program. And I think this slide is really valuable. The other thing I'll say about this slide is, like, no matter how much you feel like you've validated your product or your concept, if you're early and you don't have, tons of customers and a good chunk of revenue, you're risky. And it's hard I'm an entrepreneur. I've been guilty of this, to think that I'm low risk because I've proved out everything. And the reality is any startup is high risk. And so, again, the goal is to de-risk and to prove out those things, ideally through the SBIR process, so that other people who are willing to give you money, either customers or investors, see the reduction in the risk of your technology and your business opportunity. So again, I like this slide to, just kind of resonate in people's mind as I talk about SBIR, STTR. It's a big pot of money. So, $2.5+ billion is set aside for small business innovative research grants. And so there's 11 different agencies that give out the grants. I'll go over, I have a slide with all the agencies, but, the good news is it's definitely a big pot of money. And if you fit with the agency's needs, you can tap into that. It's equity-free funding, so there are strings attached, but they're not related to, follow-on strings like equity or, other type of compensation, for providing this money. It's simply more like, a grant or a contract where you're proposing to do a statement of work and they expect you to follow that. There are certain, aspects of doing it where you have to track your accounting and things like that appropriately. But overall, you were able to get away. Once you're done with the SBIR, you're basically done with the government involvement. And ideally, like I said before, you're positioning all this so that you're attractive to either outside investors from, investors or customers. There's two different versions of the program. The SBIR program is the biggest. It's, at this point, it's 3.2% set aside. So what that means is every agency that spends over $100 million in R&D funding has to set aside 3.2% of their budget to fund this program. So all the big agencies like Department of Defense, National Science Foundation, National Institute of Health, they have big R&D budgets, and they have to set aside a pot, 3.2% for SBIRs. There's a smaller pot of money for what's called STTRs, and I have a slide on that, but the basic idea is that those are a partnership between a research institution and a small business, whereas SBIRs are the small business applying independent of any other entity. When you're applying for this funding, and if you get this funding, you're dealing with the government and government objectives. So you really have to appreciate that concept because, there's a lot of things that you will have to do that seem frustrating and seem like they're, I've filled this out 3 times. I don't know why I have to fill it out again, even though it's a different form. There's a lot of things they want you to do that it seem cumbersome, but it's the government. So that's the downside of SBIR funding, is that you are basically becoming a pseudo-government contractor. The best advice I give to people along those lines is that when it comes to, I'll just say govies, a lot of times there's a box they have to check. And if you just think about checking that box instead of thinking about why they have to check that box and trying to debate with them on why they have to check that box, if you just think about the bare minimum they need to check that box and get that box checked, you can move on, right? So you can't fight with them because a lot of times they don't have control to change the box you have to check. So it's just really important to have that mentality going in, because otherwise, especially as us entrepreneurs, you can get really frustrated and spend a lot of time trying to, fight the system, so to speak. Phases. So there's phase 1 and phase 2 of the SBIR program. There's this concept that there's this thing called phase 3. Phase 3 is other people's money that the government records in terms of justifying the program. There is no phase 3 program. So just want to get that out there to start with, because a lot of times people are like, well, isn't there a phase 3? It's like, no, there's not. But phase 1 is really about feasibility. And think of this as commercial feasibility. So you want to answer, a lot of times I advise people to think about, like, what are the questions, and of course you don't want this to be the case, but if the answer was no, you could pack up and go home, right? Or, move on to something new. So you want to think about the tough questions you could ask that will validate that the concept is feasible. Phase 2, you can get into doing more product development and whatnot. Phase 1 is 150. Some agencies are now up to 225. Some agencies go down to 100K, 6 to 12 months. And in phase 1 for an SBIR, you can subaward out a third of the R&D. So that's something to keep in mind, especially if you're doing health-related applications. That can get a little complicated if you're trying to outsource, say, things like animal studies. And that includes consultants and subawards. So the small business needs to do at least 2/3 of the work. Phase 2, you can subaward out more money, up to 50%, and phase 2 is, 2, sometimes 3 years. So there is this concept called a fast track. The agency really that I've seen utilize it the most is National Institute of Health. You're applying for a phase 1 and a phase 2 at the same time. You really need to have it together and really understand your commercial, target, and have strong letters of support for that. One other piece of advice in going after a fast track is whatever you're putting in your phase 1 in terms of the work product, of course you won't have done it, but when the reviewers look at it, they got to be like 98% sure that you're going to be successful. All you have to do is get the money and do the work. So you can get a lot of money out of doing a fast track, and quicker, but it is a risk. But I've seen companies that have gotten fast tracks for sure. I don't have a slide on it, but there is also certain programs do direct to phase 2. A lot of times I would recommend, unless you're an active company and you have previous SBIR funding, a fast track can be less risky than going direct to phase 2, because what we found in having people go direct to phase 2, who actually really had good products, good science, good team, was that people like the National Institute of Health go, we have no track record of working with you, so we're not going to give you a direct to phase 2. I mean, they don't say that directly, but if you read the review comments, that's basically what they're saying. So where a fast track, they're giving you, they have that period of the phase 1 to make them feel more comfortable that they have time to maybe say no on the phase 2, for example, even though they're probably not going to. STTR, so an STTR, again, is a partnership between the university and the small business. The university or federal research lab has to do at least 30% of the work. The small business has to do at least 40% of the work. And there's 30% of the work that can either go to another party or to either of the first two parties I mentioned. This can be valuable if there's a lot of work you need to sub out to, say, a university partner, and the 33% limit in the SBIR is not enough to get that work done. I've seen it used that way. And another angle on STTRs that can be helpful is for most agencies, except for the National Science Foundation, your principal investigator can actually be part of the research institution and does not have to have a position or even work under the small business. With groups like National Institute of Health, even sometimes maybe National Science Foundation, the strength of your PI can have a major impact on whether you get funding or not, especially trying to get through the very stringent review panels. So that's just something to keep in mind, in terms of if you need a professor who's not going to quit their day job, and you may not want them to be part of the team and has all the credentials you need, an STTR might be a vehicle where you could subaward to the university, get them as the PI, and actually get the funding. So eligibility, this is full, you have to be a for-profit business, under 500 employees. So yes, that's a lot of employees for a lot of us, that are in startup land, but there are companies who maybe have 100 or 200 employees that could get SBIR funding. Independently owned and operated primarily in the U.S. That can be an issue with some groups, especially if it's a foreign-owned company. 51% owned or controlled by U.S. individuals. The fifth point can definitely trip people up. I've had this come up a lot in the past. The research must be performed in the U.S. With very rare exceptions, you might be able to work around that rule, but there's, the only time you're ever going to work around it is if you actually get the program manager involved and have some really, really good justification. But this can be a problem if people, for example, the one I've mentioned this a few times, but like for animal studies, if people think they can get it done cheaper overseas, but that just doesn't work with SBIRs. I had another group who was working with an engineering firm that was out of the UK or out of Europe, and we had to figure they did have a U.S. office, so we decided we were going to perform the work in the U.S. through the U.S. office. But this is just something that we've had more than not we've gotten tripped up on. So again, STTRs are a smaller pot of money. That can come up as an issue, but a lot of times what I advise is pick the mechanism that best fits your, your best proposal. Don't always think about the fact that it's a smaller pot of money, because the funding rates are about the same across the two. So it's not like you're less likely to get funding through an STTR. But not all agencies have STTRs. All the agencies have SBIRs. And I think we've covered most of the other things here. Timeline. So, this is a long process, and you got to keep in mind this is not overnight. There are gaps between phase 1 and phase 2. You have to plan for those gaps. There's gaps between writing the proposal and potentially getting the money. There's a lot of groups that I will say, like, I can work to get you funded. It may not be on the first shot. And this happens a lot with groups like even National Science Foundation, National Institute of Health, where you end up applying multiple times. So you got to consider this is not an overnight process, but startups are not an overnight process as much as we want to think they are. I'll give an example I think is a really good one. There's a group that presented in Augusta, Georgia, at a conference I went to, and they had created this, formulation and packaging for, you can buy them off the shelf at like Walgreens. They're basically like packets of all of the 6 major, Tums and Tylenol and, the generic equivalents. And the guy ended up having to raise, say, like $3 million to get his company started, and he had past success, track record of success. He said he talked to like something ridiculous, like 600, people, breakfast, lunch, and dinner in order to get 20 people to agree to fund his company. And so, 600 meetings is a lot of meetings to end up, going through to get $3 million. So when people say that the timeline is long for something like an SBIR, STTR, it's like anytime you go after and get money, unless you're just lucky, everything works out perfect, it takes a while. So I think that SBIR, STTRs can be a good mitigation strategy, but then again, it's not always great to think they're your only strategy, because, you do have this timeline that is pretty long. So that might be a good time to stop and maybe answer any questions.
Yeah, so this is Julia here. If y'all want to go ahead and type in your questions into the webinar control, you'll see the questions little section. We've already received a couple questions that I've typed some answers back to that were easily answered, but it's in that same spot is where you will type in your questions, and I'll go ahead and read them now. So we'll just take a minute. Tyler can have a sip of water and catch his breath, and then we'll read some of these questions out loud. All right, so the first question came in, and it said, are there less STTR applications? Is that why the success rates are similar between SBIR and STTR? Tyler?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, there are, I think it's because the partnership with the university is required, there are less applications, which is why the funding rates are about the same. One thing to mention too, that so depending on the agency, like National Science Foundation, National Institute of Health, Department of Energy, all of those groups, for the most, unless it's a very special topic, like you can apply for an SBIR or an STTR, and they actually don't view them necessarily differently. That's all one application coming in. The review process is the same. There are groups like Department of Defense that they have separate topics for STTRs as compared to SBIRs. Those topics are very specific. So for groups like that, it may be that, the topic you want to apply for is an STTR topic, and it's not offered as an SBIR topic. And so you might actually, and I've actually done this with my companies, I've gone out and found an academic partner because I wanted to apply for a certain topic. So so it's a really good question, and it kind of depends on the agency, and there are less STTR topics under DoD than there are SBIR topics. So.
Great, thank you. So here's another question. Is there support for writing or reviewing these applications or proposals?
Yeah, so that's why we're here. Like I said, with three-phase, if you're a South Carolina company, you can come to us, and again, there's an application. It's not extensive at all, but if we look at it and believe basically that you're SBIR fundable, then we get the chance to work with you one-on-one and walk you through that process. So we, as three-phase, are actually here to help out. So that's a great question.
All right, here's another question. I hear that the agencies say that they want to encourage new principal investigators, yet most grants are awarded to known PIs that the agencies have worked with in the past. Is this true or false?
It's a mixed bag. I'll be honest that you take a group like National Institute of Health, they like to see resume credentials or CVs, or bio sketches that have a lot of publications in that particular area. I've seen great products, great innovations, even good proposals, but the PI didn't have the right credentials. and they get beat up, in reviews. So it is a concern. You take someone like Department of Defense, they like to work with people they know. They will take unknown groups, but I've even talked to program managers who say they put out a topic and then they go call their favorite groups and ask them to apply. I've even had that happen with one of my customers where we got a call before the topics were even out. So it can be the case. Now, one thing I will say to work around that is that you can build your team, maybe not directly as the PI, but you can surround them with credible, people in the field. You can pull in consultants or have other advisors, jump on the team for a partial role, and you can potentially fill those holes and overcome that issue. So, but it is an issue to consider.
All right, so we have one more question here, and then we'll hop back in. I do see a couple questions that have been asked that I know will be answered in the duration of the slides, so I'll skip over those. But the last question we have here before we get started again is, have you ever seen a company get around the 51% U.S. citizen-owned requirement?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the answer to that gets complicated. I mean, it's basically you get into there could be some ways to work around it. It depends on the risk profile of the company. You could, have a U.S. subsidiary that's, but you have to be careful with the ownership there. I'll just say there are potential ways to work around it, but you got to have sophisticated business people engaged just to potentially overcome that issue. It's not a straightforward thing to figure out. So that's just, I'll just leave it at that. And there's no simple answer to that, unfortunately.
All right, if you want to.
Yeah, so we'll jump back in. So I say this section is what I call know your customer. And when it comes to SBIR, STTRs, your customer is the government. Temporarily is the main goal. But, with some groups like Department of Defense, you may actually hope that they become your eventual customer. So I'm going to get into the personalities of the different agencies and talk through, what the different groups are looking for. There's 11 different agencies. On the left side, you have groups that do SBIRs and STTRs. On the right are the groups that just do SBIRs. There are usually the groups that just do SBIRs do not have as much funding and they don't give out quite as many awards. The ones in this slide that have actual stars next to them do medically related technologies. Department of Agriculture is one of those ones that you may scratch your head on and go, really, they do that? One of their solicitations for their subtopics is related to rural communities. And so, agriculture happens in rural communities, and so they want to promote life, basically, in rural communities. So they will fund things maybe related to, which we worked on a topic related to telehealth. They may fund things that are education related. So they fund, various things like that are going to improve life in those communities. So it's something to think about. The catch there in talking to program managers and really learning, what they want to fund for that, because it's one of, say, 6 or 8 topics. So it's a small pot of their money. But what they want to see is that the problem is unique to a rural community and that it does not necessarily apply to urban communities. So if it's something that crosses over very easily, they may not fund it. Whereas if it's something that's because you're in a rural community, for example, getting good teachers into those communities is a problem. So there may be technology solutions to bring the content or those people, maybe not in real life, but through, internet-based solutions to those communities and bring that content in there. Same thing with telehealth. So I just like to mention that one because they have a reasonably good pot of money, and there are definitely groups that apply to the topic I just talked about. Most of what they do is traditional agriculture, though. Couple things I'll mention real quick. So National Institute of Health and National Science Foundation, their topics are their solicitation is super broad. So National Science Foundation, you know, you could fit most businesses under their solicitation, with the exceptions that I'll talk about in a little bit in terms of the technology and how innovative it is. For National Institute of Health, they have their omnibus, so anything health related, you can fit under that omnibus. And so with those agencies, I don't worry as much about the quote unquote topic. I'm just like, what are you doing and does it fit with the agency? And then from there, we just figure out, you know, a group to fit it under, but it's not a priority. With groups like Department of Defense, NASA, Department of Energy, and most of the other groups, that they have very specific topics. And so if you don't fit with one of those topics, especially with Department of Defense, like their topics can be they have hundreds and hundreds of topics a year, but their topics can be as specific as, you know, I want a battery that's 3 inches by 5 inches by 2 inches and has this power density. I mean, they can get really, really narrow. You know, some of the other agencies like Department of Energy aren't quite as narrow, but they may, for example, I have a group that does fuel cells, and we'll look at the topics, and they may fund, you know, hydrogen-based fuel cells and not solid oxide, and so they may not fit with your needs. So you just have to look and see. I was working with a biochemical group, and there was a DOE topic that was related, but they wanted anaerobic instead of aerobic processes, so it didn't fit. So anyway, just things to keep in mind. Grants versus contracts. So most agencies do grants, some do contracts. The way to think about the difference for the most part, especially with groups like I talked about, like Department of Defense or even CDC or National Institute of Health, is that contracts tend to be geared towards problems that those agencies have, where grants tend to be focused on more general problems in that subsection, like, you know, health-related problems or business-related problems, but the agency doesn't have a vested interest in the specific solution. So a good example, you know, National Institute of Health is a good one to talk about the differences. Like, their omnibus covers pretty much everything within health, but they do have contract solicitations that may be related to either a technology that they're developing internally that they want to see commercialized, or things like vaccines and dealing with, you know, getting vaccines around the world. There may be certain, you know, epidemiological things that the CDC cares about that they'll fund. So that's usually the difference between grants and contracts. Another thing to think about is, like, you know, a contract is literally that. Like, you're setting up a contract with the government to do a certain statement of work. Groups like Department of Defense and even NASA, you know, may have hard deliverables. So you may actually have to deliver things at the end. Most of them are, say, the deliverables are reports. Grants are more, you know, what they say, they're grants. There are oversight. There is, you know, you'll probably have to deliver a report or whatnot, but, you know, sometimes there's less, you know, oversight once you get the award, versus contracts is really, you know, going to be a relationship with that program manager for sure. Here's the due dates for the various groups. You know, the dates do change, so every time something comes out, I have to double check it, because, you know, things are constantly changing with the different groups and the different agencies. But this gives you an idea of kind of the flow of proposals or the flow of solicitations. Department of Defense and National Institute of Health have, basically 3 main time periods during the year that they put out solicitations. Department of Defense, they actually have, nowadays, some of these time periods, they have SBIR and STTR, solicitations within the same period. So just because it's, there's only 3 dates doesn't mean there's only 3 solicitations. For National Institute of Health, these dates are pretty solid: April 5th, September 5th, and January 5th for the main omnibus. There's a lot of special solicitations, especially the contract, that come out once a year. So depending on your topic, you may be in a position to submit, and it may not be these specific dates. You just have to kind of track things down and look to see what fits. We had a go after a solicitation that was tied to opioids and fentanyl, and it was a special topic call. And basically, when we looked at it, like most of the standard guidelines I give, I could throw some of them out the window in terms of potential fundability because they were asking for very specific things. So, but anyway, these are some of the dates. So the application criteria, so it's good to think about the personalities of the different agencies and how they make decisions. A lot of the agencies are more program manager driven. National Institute of Health is one that is very, very much reviewer driven in terms of whether you get funded or not. They score the proposals from 0 or basically 10 to 90. And the lower the score, the better. So these days, a lot of things I'm seeing that get funded have to be in the range of 20, maybe up to, some subgroups within NIH may fund something that's closer to 40. A lot of stuff has to maybe be in the low 30s, the 20s range for sure these days. And everything is peer reviewed except for contracts. Contracts is the exception there. Contracts are program manager driven, and the reviews are different for NIH, but in general, you got to think this is going through an independent review panel. All the scoring and the judging is done through that independent review panel, and once the score comes back, unless you're borderline, or the program manager just has extra money to fund you, in unique situations, the score is everything in terms of whether you get funded. Department of Defense is probably the opposite extreme. It's almost like I said, a lot of times you want to maybe even reach out and build a relationship with that program manager if you can. They like to fund people they know. They don't always do that, but and one thing about DoD that it's kind of like this back end thing that no one realizes happens. There are a lot of topics that could even be written by groups like, small businesses that want to apply. They have a pre-existing relationship, and they're like, gee, it'd be great if we tapped into this pot of money to fund this problem we've talked about for 3 years. Oh, great. Can you write the topic for me? And, there's nothing illegal going on. It's just that topic may be written by a small business, handed to the program manager. Of course, they're going to edit it and make sure they agree with it all, and then they send it up their food chain, and then the topic gets published. So, there's that stuff going on with DoD. It doesn't mean you can't get funded under one of those topics, because typically they will fund between 1 and up to 4, sometimes phase 1s. So you might be one of the high-risk, cool ideas that they liked that they don't know, but you just have to be aware that's going on in the background. Another thing about DoD I talk about is that, their review process varies depending on the program manager from what I've seen. Some are more structured and may have independent reviewers. There's some that literally may just grab 3 people from the office, hand out proposals, and, kind of see what's happening, like, hey, can you just give me an idea which ones we can throw away? National Science Foundation is somewhere in the middle. The program manager has a lot of pull, but they, they do have independent review panels, and most of the other agencies do this as well, where it's like if you score really bad with the independent reviewers, you're not going to get funded. But as you can see with National Science Foundation, their scoring is like poor to very good to actually excellent. I think they have an excellent category. And so the reason they don't have like a number or whatever, I believe, is because it gives them a lot of flexibility to say who they fund and who they don't, within a range. Those are some of the basic overviews of, criteria. I'm going to keep moving. So the DoD, and I'm not going to belabor this because a lot of people probably don't apply to DoD, Department of Defense, but the name of the game is procurement. And you got to think about anything that's funded within Department of Defense eventually has to be justified up the food chain in terms of a military or a defense need. So they may fund things that you don't realize, like medical related stuff that, they may eventually be a buyer, but there's a large market outside of that for. But there's a lot of things that are pure Department of Defense needs. And so if you can get to know the program manager, that can be a very good thing. And again, I'm skipping over some of this stuff because I want to keep on track. So risk profile and what they like to fund. NIH, National Institute of Health, Department of Defense, even to some extent like USDA, a lot of the groups, they'll fund things that are more incremental if they feel like it's serving a key need they have. So with National Institute of Health, they're more concerned, for example, about how significant the health problem is and, whether that health problem is, whether you can make a big impact there, than they are necessarily about how, quote unquote, innovative the technology is. Department of Defense is like, can you solve my problem? National Science Foundation, on the other hand, they want to see next generation technologies that are definitely, leaps above and beyond what's out there. So like, from DVD content to streaming video, like what's going to make that, of course that's already happened, but that's just an example. They want to fund things that are next generation technologies, and we run into problems trying to get groups funded that are, maybe just pulling together things that already exist or, not a significant leap. So that's something to think about with National Science Foundation. Again, they fund a huge, broad scope of things, but if it's not innovative enough, you're probably not going to get funded through them. Most of these we've talked about. NIH is reviewer decision, NSF is more staff, high risk, DoD is program manager, very much program manager. Groups like Department of Energy, USDA, NASA is probably more towards the Department of Defense model. They do have structured reviews they're more regimented there, but they're funding things that are problems they have for sure. Department of Energy is kind of a hybrid, so you can think of them more like the National Science Foundation in terms of reviewer personalities and things like that. And USDA probably fits more with the National Science Foundation model. And I'm just mentioning the biggest funders. So review criteria for NIH, kind of looking at it from a little bit different stance. The significance of the problem and the investigators have a huge impact with reviewers for NIH. It's especially the investigator aspect of it, and that was part of the previous question. It's unfortunate because I think this does, eliminate things that could be new and a little bit unfounded, but highly impactful. But, if you don't have the right credentials and publications and, team members that show credibility that the technology has been scientifically vetted and that the team really understands how to, scientific rigor, then we've seen a lot of things that get kicked back from NIH, unfortunately. But the other thing to think about is, it is important to highlight the significance of the problem and think about dollars and cents, So how much is this costing the healthcare system? How many people are affected? How many people are dying? How much per patient does it cost? Like, a lot of times I see, people write out the significance section and they don't cover those sort of topics. They kind of, they keep it very vague and qualitative, but I think it's very important to go quantitative, because you got to think they're stacking up your proposal versus other ones. And if they see like this has a $1 billion impact and yours has a, they don't even know what the impact is because you haven't put it in there, then they may take a bigger risk on the $1 billion one. NSF, so they're very much focused on product market fit. You really do have to have a solid technology, and you want to thoroughly, highlight the intricacies of your technology for sure. But because of what's called I-Core, and I-Core is a whole separate program where they basically walk you through going after and talking to 100 different, partners, customers, or people related to your technology and forcing you to understand the product market fit. Because that program exists, even though it's independent of the SBIR program, it has changed the way NSF, not only, it's changed both the proposal format and the way they review proposals. So it's really important to talk about the customer. And, I even advise people to tell me the title of the person who will buy the product. Talk about the value proposition, put it into numbers. Are you reducing cost? Are you improving, potential revenue? And how much? Because every buyer has a point at which they're interested. Some buyers, you may be able to show a 1% cost reduction, and that can be huge for them, like something like, the oil and gas industry or chemical production. Whereas other groups may need to see 90% reduction in cost before they will ever switch to anything new. So you need to spell out the value proposition in as much detail as possible. So those are some of the key things with National Science Foundation is how much can you articulate your customers. So know what you're missing. I'm just going to skip through this kind of quickly because we're getting tight on time. So 10 questions. A lot of this we've covered. Have I completed my registrations? I have a slide on this, so I'll talk more about that, but it's amazing how many groups I work with where, it's a month out and they haven't done any of the registration stuff, and then they may even miss the deadline because they don't get it done quickly enough. Do the registrations. You have to register with DUNS. You have to register with SAM.gov. And then all the agencies have their own websites you have to register on. Do the registrations as soon as you think about maybe doing an SBIR STTR, and then it's just done. Did I talk to the program manager? Some program managers are accessible, some are not, but if you can talk to them, it's always a good idea. One thing I'll mention too is, especially with a group like National Institute of Health, because the program managers are not, making necessarily hard decisions on funding, because they have independent review panels, they are almost like an internal coach for you. So they will give you great insights. They will walk you through, they'll review your AIMS page. They'll, they can be very helpful, but treat them like a coach, So anyway, I just like to mention that about NIH. Read the guidelines. I mean, if you're working with us, we'll walk you through it too, but things change all the time. There's little intricate details that you don't realize. We were working on a Department of Transportation proposal, and typically the split of, subaward versus small business is gauged based off of dollar figures, but the Department of Transportation actually wants you to tell the number of hours worked for the subawardees and consultants and the number of hours worked under the small business, and they use those numbers, so take the total and take the subaward hours divided by the total, and if that is less than 33.3%, you're okay. I mean, that's a very weird way to calculate it, but you got to read the solicitations and make sure you understand them if you're doing it on your own, because there's a lot of things like that that can trip you up. So again, most of this other stuff we've covered. Letters of permission, I'll just talk about this real quick. So with certain agencies, like some agencies practically, they don't even put places in there for letters. Other agencies like National Science Foundation, you can get up to 3 outside letters from customers and whatnot. If you don't have 3, you may not get funded, although you can only have 3. So they're very strong on support letters. They, as well as, groups like National Institute of Health, want to see letters from, say, the university for the IP. If you're going to rent facilities, they want letters from the incubator saying that they will give you a spot if you get funded. Subawardees, you need letters from subawardees. So just be aware of all these letters you have to get, that are kind of permission letters. I think that's all I'll talk about on this slide. Title, titles, it's really good to put the product and the problem into the title and even the value proposition. So is it low cost? Is it, higher throughput? Is it, reducing the size and the cost? Think about what you're trying to portray there. Make sure it's in the title. So electronic registrations, like we talked, so this is my slide on registration. So all companies need to, of course you have to form your company, which sometimes is an issue. As forming your company, you should have at least a tax ID number, EIN number. Then you go and you register with DUNS, and you'll get what's called a DUNS number. Then you go and you register with SAM.gov. There is a notarized letter you have to send in, although that doesn't stop your registration from getting approved. SAM.gov is the toughest one because it can take up to 10 business days for them to approve your registration. So you have to plan ahead, and sometimes it can take more time. So I've seen it drag out a month if they have questions and you answer them wrong. So get that registration done as soon as possible. And then you got to register with the SBIR site. And then, for the various agencies, they have different places you have to register. NIH, for example, you have to do grants.gov, then ERA Commons, and your PI also has to have an ERA Commons account. So just be aware of all the registrations and how you're going to actually submit the proposal. Here's a slide about the online registrations, in the different sites. Surprisingly, Department of Defense is one of the easiest to submit a proposal through. They have a cover page, you put your budget in online, and then you actually submit your tech proposal, and that's pretty much it. Where NIH is the worst. They're super complicated. And that's it. So, again, this was a fast overview. We'll stop, take any further questions you all might have, and hopefully this was valuable content.
Great. Thank you, Tyler. Thank you so much. So we will accept your questions in the question section of the webinar controls, and one just came in. It says, it looks like this is related to a couple of slides ago. It says, are grants still related to specific topics that an agency has published that it has interest in?
So this is a good question. Again, we covered some of it, but I don't think you can cover it enough. So it all depends on the agency. Again, like you look at like National Institute of Health, National Science Foundation, and even like anything agriculture related tied to USDA. Those agencies have very broad solicitations, and so anything health related you can fit under NIH. Anything highly innovative you can probably fit it under, NSF solicitation. And anything ag related you can probably fit it under USDA. But a lot of the other agencies have very specific needs, and they are more like the contract or special solicitations. And so those are more the agency's, focused problems. One other aspect of that question that, especially with a group like Department of Defense, you can look to see, for example, if you feel like your technology fits with a certain area within Department of Defense, you can actually go Google and either look at past topics or look at current, even non-SBIR related topics, and potentially leverage that, or publications or things like that, and leverage those vehicles to learn who cares about your problem. Go talk to them, and maybe even just ask them, do you do SBIRs? And you may even find people within those certain groups where you could get a topic pushed through, and they didn't even realize they could push it through. So it's a good question. Just to reemphasize, it depends on the agency, and sometimes you can tee topics up for yourself.
Interesting. So another question came in about the VA. Does the VA have any related program?
So there's not a targeted VA program, but groups like National Institute of Health, for example, will fund things that can be VA related. We had a group, for example, that was doing things related to PTSD, and they ended up going after a National Institute of Health topic, and it was under the omnibus, but the program manager specifically was interested in PTSD as it related to the VA and things along those lines. Sometimes, and this group did this, is you can even look at topics like that, and you can actually use the VA as a partner instead of looking them as a funding source, and get NIH to fund the topic because you have them as a partner. So don't always think about the VA as just a funding source. Think of them as a potential partner as well. So like this group, they ended up partnering with the university, but the conversation started by talking to someone at the VA about that problem.
Interesting. So before we continue, I do want to mention that SCRA offers a matching grant worth up to $50,000, and this is for any company. They can receive one matching grant per solicitation. Per solicitation year, and each company is limited to 2 SBIR, STTR matching grants in the company's lifetime. So if you are interested in if you have won an SBIR or an STTR award, you can go onto our website at scra.org/apply. I'm trying to do this off of memory. But anyway, it's scra.org/funding. And there you can find out about our funding opportunities. A question came in that says, is this matching grant only for Phase 1 awards? And that's a great question, and the answer is no. We only offer matching grants for SBIR and STTR Phase 2 awards. Okay, so there are other programs out there that support Phase 1 awards with matching grants. And one in particular that SCRA also helps manage is the EPSCoR program. You can find that as well on the SCRA website, but no, for this matching grant that I speak of, it is only for Phase 2 awards. So are there any other questions? I'd like to keep the line open. We did have some questions about sharing the slide deck, and yes, we can share this slide deck, and this entire webinar is available on the SCRA website, so you can find it there. I believe we're going to post it as soon as it's, downloaded and We'll just go ahead and upload it, and you'll be able to find it there, but I will send this out as well. And then you can see right here a place where you can contact Tyler, Tyler at 3phasesc.com. And then if you have questions for SCRA or questions for me, you can email me directly. It's julia.linton@scra.org. We'll leave the line open for just a second here to see if any other questions come in. All right. Well, I want to thank you, Tyler, so much for this time and the opportunity to speak to all of us here. We really, really appreciate your knowledge, and thank you all for joining us.
No, I appreciate you joining us, and again, even if you just have questions or you want to talk through your company and you know the potential for SBIR funding, just reach out. We do a lot of phone calls with people just to talk through whether it's a fit and what makes sense. So that's what we're here for. So just give us a call, contact me via email, and we'll set up the phone call.
Great. Thank you, Tyler, so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Definitely. All right. I'm going to sign off now, but please check our website for future Launch and Learns. Take care.